Welcome back to the program. I'm Roby Brock, joined now by State Senator Joyce Elliott. She's a Democrat from Little Rock, and she's the Democratic candidate for the Second Congressional District for a second time.
For a second time,
Yeah.
and you know, I'm not easily intimidated. I don't mind coming back.
Talk to me about when did you make the decision to get into this race, and why did you make the decision to get in this race?
I had been hoping that somebody else would, because there are people out there that I thought were capable, but it became pretty clear toward the past weekend that that was not going to happen. And I feel confident I'm qualified for it. You know, I've been a person who dedicated her life to Arkansas. I made that choice. I didn't leave. I chose to be a school teacher here for 30 years. And, you know, I am a person who served in the House in Arkansas. I've served in the Senate in Arkansas. And through all of that, and I am comfortable, if you ask Democrats or Republicans, they will tell you I've always been a fair player and an upright person. And so I feel very confident that I have the will and the skills to get out there and do the hard work of getting those votes. And I don't think there's anybody with whom I've ever dealt that would not tell you I'm not fair. And that's why I often say to people, when I die, if on my tombstone it says, she was fair, she treated people right, that would be good enough for me.
Be okay with that.
So those are the kind of values I want to take to Washington to try to make things better for all of us.
I don't have to remind you, because you've been reminded plenty of times this week, that you lost by 20 points in
Yes,
2010 when you
right.
ran for this race. A lot of times when you get to do things a second time, you do things differently. What will be different this time?
I think it's not as much as I will do things differently. I mean, I will, because the times have changed. But that's what's really key. The times are so different. In 2010, you know, that was probably the toughest time for anybody to run as a Democrat. But people were in high anxiety. We were just coming into the middle of a very difficult recession. And we had just had Barack Obama elected to the presidency, and a lot of people were kind of bothered by that, and we were working at trying to make sure we were making big changes in Washington, like, for example, talking about the ACA, which many people, you know, from that time, over 300,000 people or so in Arkansas have really benefited from. And I think this is a time, too, when the country has just opened more to, especially to electing more women. And I think this time I have a chance for people to know more about who I am, because there are just so many more ways out there to be known. And I haven't spent my time just sitting idly by since 2010. I went right back to doing the hard work I'd always been doing. And that's brought me into contact with many, many more people.
Give me the biggest contrast between you and Congressman Hill. This will be an election about contrast. You will have to give voters a reason to not vote for him and to vote for you. Obviously, you'll both have your bases, but you'll be playing for voters that'll be open to change. What is the biggest difference? What are the biggest differences?
I think that people really need to know that I am really not running to be French Hill #2, and they deserve this contrast. But I'm a person, you know, who has had to work from the foundation up. And on the way of working from the foundation up, growing up in this small town, and growing up, you know, nobody wants to be in poverty, but I was. And I see and I know how people struggle. You know, when you're at the top so many times, if you haven't had to do this from the ground up, you don't understand what people go through. And I think that's probably a big difference. Because if Congressman Hill understands, for instance, that everybody needs to have health care. He has probably always had it. I haven't always had it, so I know what that means. And so for him to continually vote against the ACA over and over, when people in Arkansas are very much in need, and we were the first state to expand, and to somehow to try to thwart that in Washington, I think is not of goodwill. And he has pretty much championed the folks who are at the top of the pyramid, because he voted for the tax increase that
you would have voted against.
I would have voted against it, not because people don't deserve tax increases, but because
tax decreases.
Decreases, yeah. Because there needs to be a balance of thinking about what are your priorities. I think we have very different priorities. Because my priority in that case would have been that what have we done to make sure that the people who are struggling, those who are lower middle class, those who are middle class, what are we doing to make sure that they are not still stuck in the same place they would have been 20 years ago? Is it really my function here to make sure that those who have the most continue to get the most. So if this country is going to get back to its roots, we have to have somebody there who understands we have got to continue to enable people to have an opportunity from the ground up, and not say we're going to give all the opportunity to those who are on top and assuming they're going to push something down, because we've learned after all these years, trickle down has not worked.
We'll hit on some issues as the campaign develops a little bit more too. I would like to stake out a little bit more and hear more about where you stand on a few things. Let's talk about impeachment. It has obviously been the public hearing started this week.
Yes.
Lots of pretty interesting testimony came out. You got a lot of both sides kind of spinning their side of events right there. Where do you stand today on the impeachment inquiry? Have you seen enough to say the president should be impeached?
I have not seen enough to say that, because originally I started with hoping people know I was fair, and for me that even extends to the president. So I think Congress is doing the right thing and making sure they are thoughtful and careful and examine the information, listen to what the witnesses have to say, and make a decision based on the facts, not on what Joyce Elliott has. And so I always hold myself out to know, if I were not in that courtroom, for example, I can have opinions, but I try to wait to have any opinions that are worth sharing until we know more information. And I know it's going to be a big subject of discussion over the country. It may or may not be in the Second District, but I hope the committee will continue to move ahead carefully and thoughtfully. And when or if it goes to the Senate for a trial, I hope they will do the same thing and not just draw their conclusions before they go through that process. It is the American way, and I extend that to the president just as I do anybody else.
Let's drill down into the Little Rock School District, which has obviously been a big issue, and you have been out front and outspoken on your support for the teachers who did go on strike there. You mentioned your education background. It seems to me at the heart of the matter is an interest in having full local control immediately. This is a phrase that I hear a lot. What does full local control immediately mean?
It means that, for example, there are 7 counties, in District 2. But it means that for every local school district, you have an elected board that makes decisions for you within the law. And for 5 years, we have had our school board removed. And Little Rock should be no different from the rest of the school districts all over this state under the law, because at this point, people would be led to believe that the law dictates that Little Rock remain under state control. That is not in the law. What the law says is that they may do that, but they need to have a good reason for doing it. And right now, they don't, because...
Well, the reason that they've thrown out, and playing devil's advocate with you here, is that there are still some schools that are not up to par and in terms of state standards, and the state does have some responsibility for that under the Lakeview decision.
Yes, and here's the problem with what they're saying. For the last 5 years, they have taken over Little Rock. We've had taxation without representation per the State Board of Education and Johnny Key. Right when they started, and there was no need to take over the entire district, there were 6 out of 48 schools that had been labeled as failing schools. Now there are 8. Now after 5 years, there are more schools that are considered failing schools than there were when we started out. I think that's reason enough to be careful and not use the government to go further than they should. For 5 years, if all you've done is gone backward, this needs to be returned to people. We have paid taxes for all this time. All kind of changes have been made without representation. And at the meeting just yesterday, we're set to have all kinds of other changes made without representation. I don't want that for us or for anybody, in the state.
Last question for you on this subject, and then we'll need to wrap up. The governor was in studio a little bit earlier. There's obviously been a lot of heated words on both sides of this issue here. He has indicated when he stepped off set that he thought that he might reach out to the Martin Luther King Commission to try to be some sort of bridge to improve the communication between the state board, his office, the folks in the Little Rock School District that are as passionate as they are. Does that strike you as something that there would be openness to?
I suppose there would be openness to it, but I don't know what that would necessarily accomplish, because I don't think that's the function of the MLK committee. I don't know that there are people on that commission with more expertise than anybody else when it comes to listening and communication. Because we have a communication problem mainly because I think the state board just doesn't listen to what people in Little Rock want. We have all of these meetings and people go and they participate and basically nothing changes. So we don't have a communication problem so much as we have, I think, a deliberate listening and caring about what people are saying to you and acting on it. Because people need to understand there is a group of folks who have agendas for Little Rock. And there's no need to listen when you already know what you're going to do. And the large part of that is to take over this district and charterize, and that will lead to privatizing our schools. We know this. It's happened all over the country. And you just think about the cities where it's happening. You get a pattern like Detroit, Philadelphia, Atlanta, Houston, Cleveland. And so what we're doing basically is taking over schools that have many, many black and brown students in them. And rather than address the structures that are leading to outcomes for kids that we can then use and say the kids failed rather than the adults failed, that's what we're doing all over this country and coming in and taking over the schools, and the kids deserve better.
I got to end the conversation there, although I think we could go on for another couple of hours because there's all kinds of devil's advocacy for me to play with you on that, as well as some things that I do support the position on there. Senator Joyce Elliott, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Wish you the best. Look forward to having you back in the studio over the next year.
All right, I'm sure we'll be here a lot. I hope.
That's all for today's program. I'm Roby Brock. Thanks so much for tuning in. We'll see you next time.